The red Ferrari sat under the white lights of the private garage like a wounded animal, flawless on the outside, yet utterly lifeless within. And Sophia Romano hated how it mirrored her own frustration. Because she was the CEO of Romano Motors, one of the youngest and most powerful automotive leaders in Europe, and yet for the first time in her career she was powerless. Watching her personal Ferrari, custom-built limited edition, worth more than most people's homes, refuse to start, refuse to respond, refuse to be understood, even after 7 of the best engineers in her company had torn it apart piece by piece, scanned every sensor, rewritten software, replaced parts that didn't even show signs of failure, and still the engine died after exactly 43 seconds. Every single time, like it was mocking them, and Sophia's patience, already thin from board pressure and media expectations, snapped when the head engineer quietly admitted, "We don't know what's wrong." Words she had never heard in her life from her own people. Words that echoed in her head as the engineers left the garage one by one, leaving behind silence and the faint smell of fuel. And in that silence, Sophia felt something, unfamiliar doubt, until her assistant mentioned a mechanic down by the old industrial district, someone who had worked on engines long before digital diagnostics ruled the world. A man named Elias, and Sophia almost laughed. Because what could a grease-stained mechanic possibly do that her elite engineers couldn't? Yet desperation has a way of humbling even the proudest leaders. And that night, against her instincts, she ordered the Ferrari transported, quietly to a forgotten workshop, where rusted tools hung on, concrete walls and the lights flickered like they hadn't been, replaced in years. And when Elias finally emerged from beneath another car, wiping his hands on an old rag, Sophia felt irritation rise again, because he didn't bow, didn't ask who she was, didn't even look impressed by the Ferrari. He just walked around it slowly, touching nothing, listening, as if the car were speaking to him. And when she impatiently explained the problem, listing everything her engineers had done, Elias stopped her mid-sentence and said something that made her freeze. "They're listening to the computer, not the engine." And before she could respond, he opened the hood and did something none of her engineers had done. He disconnected the battery completely, then sat on a crate beside the car and waited. 5 full minutes of silence. 5 minutes where Sophia felt her authority shrinking with every tick of the clock. And then Elias reconnected the battery, started the engine manually, and let it idle while he placed his hand directly on the engine block, closing his eyes. And when the engine died again at 43 seconds, Elias smiled faintly, not in triumph but in understanding, and said, "It's not broken. It's confused," a sentence so absurd Sophia almost walked out until he explained that the Ferrari's hybrid system was fighting itself, a rare conflict between thermal expansion in the engine housing and a software safety protocol designed for colder climates, something that wouldn't show up in standard diagnostics, because on paper everything was perfect. But in reality, the engine was being suffocated by its own protection, and Sophia felt something shift inside her. Because this man wasn't guessing, he was listening. And as Elias began adjusting a single mechanical valve that no engineer had touched, because the software claimed it was fine, Sophia realized this wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about arrogance versus understanding, theory versus experience. And as the engine roared back to life and passed 43 seconds, then a minute, then 5, filling the workshop with a sound so pure it sent chills down her spine, Sophia understood that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs don't come from the smartest minds in the room, but from the ones willing to get their hands dirty. And if this moment already had you hooked, imagine what happens next. Because what Elias does after this doesn't just fix a Ferrari, it changes the future of an entire company. So make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because stories like this only get deeper, more powerful, and more unforgettable from here. When the Ferrari continued running smoothly for over 20 minutes, Sophia didn't celebrate, didn't smile, didn't even speak, because her mind was racing faster than the engine itself, realizing the implications of what had just happened, realizing that the man standing in front of her with oil-stained hands had just exposed a blind spot in her entire company's philosophy. And as she ordered her security team to step back and invited Elias to explain everything again, slowly, in detail, she saw her world differently. Because Elias spoke not in charts or algorithms, but in stories, about engines he'd fixed in deserts and freezing mountains, about how metal behaves under stress, how machines remember their past use, how perfection on paper often fails in real life. And Sophia felt something rare for a CEO respect, and the next morning, she did something no executive had done before. She brought Elias into Romano Motors' headquarters, past glass walls and polished floors, straight into a boardroom full of executives who looked at him like he didn't belong. And when the head engineer questioned his credentials, Elias didn't argue, he simply asked for the same Ferrari and the same problem to be recreated in front of them, and as he demonstrated how the issue could return if the car was driven aggressively in high temperatures, then disappear again with a minor mechanical adjustment. The room fell silent because data alone couldn't argue with reality, and Sophia watched her executives struggle, not with the solution, but with their own pride. And in that moment, she made a decision that would shock the automotive world. She created a new division inside Romano Motors, one that paired veteran mechanics with young engineers, forcing theory and experience to work together. And she placed Elias at its head. Not because he wanted the title, he didn't, but because leadership isn't about ambition, it's about impact. And the media backlash was immediate. Headlines mocking the garage mechanic promoted to genius, stock prices dipping briefly, but then something extraordinary happened. Romano Motors' failure rates dropped, customer satisfaction rose, and innovation accelerated faster than it ever had before. Because machines were no longer treated as numbers, but as systems that lived in the real world. And months later, when Sophia stood on a stage unveiling a new supercar designed under this hybrid philosophy, she told the Ferrari story publicly for the first time, admitting that her company's greatest lesson came not from its smartest engineers, but from a man who listened when others calculated. And as applause filled the hall, Sophia locked eyes with Elias in the crowd, knowing that success isn't about knowing everything, it's about knowing when to learn. And if you're watching this story and it moved you, inspired you, or made you see the world differently, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel right now, because every story we tell is a reminder that greatness often comes from the most unexpected places, and the next one might change the way you see success forever. The real test of Sophia Romano's decision didn't come from the media or the shareholders, but from inside the company itself, where quiet resistance spread like a slow-burning fire. Because engineers who had spent years building their identities around degrees and simulations felt threatened by a man who trusted his hands more than spreadsheets. And Elias felt it immediately as he walked the spotless corridors of Romano Motors every morning, his boots echoing against marble floors that had never known grease. Yet instead of trying to fit in, he did the opposite, tearing down walls between departments, pulling engineers out of climate-controlled offices and into noisy test garages, forcing them to hear engines under stress, to smell overheating metal, to feel vibrations instead of reading them. And at first, productivity dropped. Tempers flared, meetings turned tense. But then something unexpected happened. A young engineer named Luca noticed a recurring micro-failure in a prototype, gearbox that software had ignored, something Elias had warned about weeks earlier. And when Luca acknowledged it publicly, something shifted, pride softened into curiosity, and collaboration slowly replaced competition. And Sophia watched this transformation from above, realizing that leadership wasn't about protecting systems, but about challenging them, even when it made people uncomfortable. And when Romano Motors released its first vehicle built under this new philosophy, a mid-range sports car designed not just for performance, but resilience, it outsold projections within weeks, not because it was the fastest, but because it worked flawlessly in conditions competitors ignored: deserts, traffic jams, long-distance abuse, real life. And customers noticed, writing reviews that spoke of trust instead of specs. And one evening, as Sophia drove the once-cursed Ferrari through a mountain pass, she realized that car had never been her greatest problem. It had been a message, one she was finally ready to hear. And if you're still watching right now, understand this. Every breakthrough begins with a failure someone else gives up on. So subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter shows what happens when success attracts enemies. Success always brings shadows, And Romano Motors' sudden rise caught the attention of competitors who had dismissed Sophia's approach as reckless. And when a rival manufacturer quietly hired away two senior engineers who had opposed Elias from the start, no one suspected what came next, until confidential design principles leaked, twisted and rebranded as traditional engineering, evolution, and suddenly the market was flooded with cheap imitations that claimed to blend experience and data without truly understanding either. And when those vehicles began failing catastrophically under stress, public trust wavered, not just in the rivals, but in the philosophy itself, and Sophia faced the hardest decision of her career. Whether to publicly distance Romano Motors from the idea she had championed or stand firm and risk being associated with failure. She didn't cause, and Elias, sensing her doubt, did something shocking. He offered to resign, believing the movement mattered more than his role in it, but Sophia refused, realizing that true leadership isn't abandoning your people when things get difficult. It's standing with them when standing costs you something. And instead of issuing press releases, she invited journalists to witness Romano Motors' testing process firsthand, showing raw failures, brutal stress tests, and the uncomfortable truth that innovation isn't clean or safe. And the gamble worked because honesty cut through fear. And when rival vehicles were recalled while Romano Motors' cars kept running, the narrative flipped overnight, turning imitation into exposure. And Elias's philosophy became a standard others rushed to understand but could no longer copy. And if this story is teaching you something about courage under pressure, make sure you subscribe, because the final chapter brings the most unexpected moment of all. Years later, long after the Ferrari incident became legend inside Romano Motors, Sophia stood alone in the same forgotten garage where it had all begun. Now restored but intentionally unchanged, oil stains preserved like history, because Elias was retiring, not with a press conference or awards, but quietly, the way he had always worked. And as Sophia handed him the keys to the original Ferrari, now restored, recalibrated and fully his, she admitted something she had never said aloud, that without that failure, she would have built a successful company, but never a meaningful one. And Elias replied with words that stayed with her forever. Machines don't fail to embarrass us. They fail to teach us. And as he drove away, Sophia realized that legacy isn't about what you create, but what you change in others. And today, Romano Motors is studied not just for its vehicles, but for its culture, proof that when humility meets experience, innovation becomes unstoppable. And if you've stayed with this story until now, then you already understand why stories like this matter. So don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, because every story we share is designed to inspire, challenge, and remind you that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who changes everything.